thrown into the freezing wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a stolen hatchet, Madeline was meant to disappear. Instead, she dug deep into the frozen earth. This is the unbelievable true story of absolute betrayal, an underground Willow fortress, and the ultimate winter survival revenge. The heavy oak door of the Harrison family lodge slammed shut, with a finality that echoed through the dense Montana pines. The metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot in the crisp November air. Madeline Harrison stood on the frost-covered porch, her breath forming frantic white plumes in front of her face. Through the frosted glass of the window, she could see the shadowed silhouette of her older stepbrother, Everett Jenkins, watching her. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. He simply turned his back and retreated into the warmth of the fire-lit living room, leaving her to the mercy of the incoming winter. It was a betrayal so profound, so legally orchestrated, that it left Madeline entirely unmoored. When their father passed away unexpectedly just 3 weeks prior, Everett had produced a modified will, a document teeming with legal loopholes and quiet addendums signed during her father's final, heavily medicated days. The estate, the lodge, the bank accounts, everything went to Everett. Madeline's inheritance was reduced to a single, mocking consolation prize. A 10-acre tract of useless, marshy timberland 20 miles off the main road, bordering the unforgiving Bitterroot Mountains. It was a plot known locally as Miller's Hollow, infamous for its flash floods in the spring and brutal, wind-scoured isolation in the winter. Everett had given her exactly 10 minutes to gather her things. In her canvas duffel bag, Madeline had managed to shove a heavy wool blanket, a rusted hand hatchet from the woodshed, a fire striker, a metal camping pot, a few pairs of thick wool socks, and 3 cans of beans. She wore her father's oversized insulated canvas jacket and sturdy leather boots. She had no vehicle. She had no cell service. The nearest town was a 30-mile hike through rugged, predator-dense terrain, and a historic blizzard was forecasted to hit within 48 hours. Everett knew this. He wasn't just kicking her out. He was relying on the mountains to erase her. Panic clawed at her throat, but Madeline swallowed it down, forcing the cold air into her lungs. Anger was a better fuel than fear. If she tried to walk to town, the exposure would kill her before she made it halfway. Her only option was to hike the 6 miles to Miller's Hollow and figure out a way to survive the night. The trek was a waking nightmare. The temperature plummeted as the afternoon sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow-dusted forest floor. Every step was a battle against the biting wind that whipped through the valley, carrying with it the sharp, icy sting of impending snow. By the time Madeline reached the edge of her property, her legs were leaden, and she could no longer feel her toes. Miller's Hollow was exactly as desolate as she remembered from her childhood. It was a sunken ravine, choked with deadfall and dominated by a sprawling network of ancient, twisting willow trees that thrived in the marshy soil. The wind howled through the barren branches, a mournful sound that seemed to welcome her to her grave. Madeline dropped her bag, her muscles trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. She scanned the environment. Building a traditional lean-to or A-frame shelter above ground was out of the question. The wind sweeping through the hollow would tear it apart, and the ambient cold would seep through any thin walls she could construct from deadwood. She needed insulation. She needed something the wind couldn't touch. She remembered an old survival book her father used to read by the fire. "The earth is a blanket," he had told her once, pointing to a diagram of a root cellar. "Go below the frost line, and the ground stays a constant 50 degrees. It's the surface that kills you. She looked down at the soft, sandy loam bank near the base of the ravine, sheltered slightly by the massive, sprawling roots of an overturned Douglas fir. The ground here wasn't fully frozen yet, insulated by a thick layer of dead pine needles and the natural depression of the earth. If she couldn't build up, she would build down. With daylight rapidly fading and the first fat flakes of snow beginning to fall, Madeline unzipped her bag and pulled out the rusted hatchet. She didn't have a shovel. She had her hands, a piece of flat shale rock she found near a frozen creek bed, and a desperate, burning will to live. Falling to her knees, she began to dig. The first few hours of excavation were agonizing. Madeline used the flat shale rock to score the earth, chopping away at the top layer of hardened soil and frozen moss with her hatchet before scooping the dirt out with her bare, blistering hands. The soil beneath the surface was damp and dense, rich with clay and interwoven with tough, fibrous roots. Every handful felt like lifting lead. By midnight, her fingernails were cracked and bleeding, her muscles screaming in protest. But she had managed to carve out a circular pit against the bank of the ravine, roughly 4 feet deep and 6 feet across. It was just large enough for her to curl up inside. She dragged her canvas bag into the hole and collapsed, wrapping herself in the wool blanket. The sheer exhaustion momentarily overrode the freezing temperatures, but the night was a brutal teacher. She shivered violently, drifting in and out of a restless, terrifying sleep, listening to the wind scream over the lip of her pit. The earth walls blocked the wind, but the open top left her exposed to the falling snow. When morning broke, a thin layer of white covered her blanket. Madeline woke with a gasp, her joints stiff and aching, her breath shallow. The temperature had dropped into the teens. She knew with absolute certainty that if she spent another night exposed like this, she would not wake up. She crawled out of the pit and forced her frozen limbs to move, doing jumping jacks until her blood began to circulate. She needed a roof, and not just any roof. She needed a structure strong enough to hold the weight of the heavy mountain snows that would soon bury this ravine, and insulated enough to trap the heat of a small fire. This was where the willows of Miller's Hollow became her salvation. Willow branches are incredibly pliable when green, capable of bending without snapping, yet remarkably strong when woven together. Armed with her hatchet, Madeline spent the morning harvesting dozens of long, flexible willow shoots from the surrounding marsh. She began by driving thick, sturdy branches deep into the dirt around the rim of her excavated pit, spacing them about a foot apart. These were her foundation pillars. Then, taking the thinner, more flexible willow whips, she began to weave. Over and under, intertwining the branches horizontally through the upright pillars. Her fingers, numb and bleeding, fumbled with the wood, but the rhythm of the work became a desperate meditation. As the woven walls rose above the lip of the pit, she gradually angled the upright pillars inward, bending them toward the center until they met at the top, tying them together with strips of fabric torn from the lining of her duffel bag. The result was a tightly woven, dome-shaped basket sitting over her earthen hole. It looked primitive, but it was structurally brilliant. The curved dome would distribute the weight of the snow evenly, preventing collapse. But a willow basket wouldn't keep the cold out. She needed insulation. Madeline spent the afternoon hauling massive armfuls of dry pine needles, dead leaves and moss, stuffing them tightly into the gaps of the willow weave. She then trudged down to the half-frozen creek, using her cooking pot to haul icy, clay-heavy mud. She slapped the freezing mud over the leafy insulation, packing it densely onto the willow dome. It was agonizing work. Her hands were so cold, she could barely feel them slapping the wet earth against the structure. But she knew the incoming freeze was her greatest ally. Once the temperature plummeted again tonight, this wet mud would freeze solid, creating an impenetrable wind-proof shell, a concrete-like bunker made of ice and earth. She left a small, reinforced hole at the top of the dome for a chimney and a narrow tunnel at the base, just wide enough for her to crawl through, facing away from the prevailing winds. As dusk approached, the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple. The forecasted blizzard had arrived. The wind began to roar through the pines, snapping branches and driving snow sideways in blinding sheets. Madeline crawled through the narrow entrance into her dark, damp underground shelter, dragging a bundle of dry deadwood she had gathered. She blocked the tunnel entrance with her canvas bag and a thick pile of pine boughs. Inside, it was pitch black and smelled heavily of raw earth and damp roots. With trembling hands, she struck her ferrocerium rod against the back of her hatchet. Sparks rained down onto a small nest of dry birch bark and pocket lint. Once, twice, 3 times, on the 4th strike, a tiny orange flame leaped to life. She gently fed it twigs, holding her breath, praying the ventilation would work. The fire caught. The smoke drifted upward, miraculously finding the chimney hole and pulling out into the storm. As the flames grew, casting dancing orange shadows against the woven willow and mud walls, a profound, life-saving warmth began to fill the small space. The earthen walls reflected the heat back at her. The howling of the blizzard outside was muffled, reduced to a dull, distant roar. Madeline sat cross-legged in the dirt, holding her bleeding hands toward the fire, and let out a sob that was half exhaustion, half triumph. She had beaten Everett's death sentence. She had survived the first phase, but as she opened her first can of beans, the stark reality of her situation settled over her. She had roughly 3 days of food. The storm outside was dumping feet of snow, locking her into the hollow. And just before she had crawled into the shelter, she had seen something in the mud by the creek. It was a fresh footprint, massive, clawed, and heavy enough to sink 2 inches into the freezing clay. She was warm, but she was entirely alone in the territory of a very large, hungry predator preparing for winter, and the battle for survival had only just begun. The blizzard raged for 4 uninterrupted days, burying Miller's Hollow under 5 feet of dense, suffocating snow. Inside her subterranean Willow fortress, Madeline was entombed in a terrifying, silent darkness, broken only by the flickering, weak glow of her meager fire. The frozen mud and woven willow branches held fast under the immense weight of the snowdrift, exactly as she had calculated. The earthen walls, baked by the constant small fire, radiated a steady, life-saving warmth. But the victory of surviving the storm was rapidly overshadowed by a much more insidious threat: starvation. By the 5th morning, the wind finally died down, leaving an eerie, muffled stillness in its wake. Madeline carefully dismantled the barricade of pine boughs and her canvas bag at the entrance. She had to use her rusted hatchet to chop through the wall of packed snow blocking her tunnel. When she finally broke the surface, the blinding white glare of the sun on the fresh powder forced her to shield her eyes. The landscape was unrecognizable. The massive, twisting willows were reduced to mere bumps under the undulating white dunes. Her stomach clamped down with a painful, hollow ache. Her 3 cans of beans were gone, the empty tins now repurposed as snow-melting pots. Madeline knew that a human could survive weeks without food, but in sub-zero temperatures, The body burned through caloric reserves at a terrifying rate just to shiver. If she didn't find sustenance soon, the cold wouldn't kill her. Her own failing metabolism would. She remembered the teachings of Wyatt, an old, grizzled mountain trapper who used to drink whiskey with her father on the lodge porch. Wyatt had always said, "The woods are a grocery store, girl, if you know which aisles to walk." Armed with her hatchet and wrapped in her wool blanket like a cloak, Madeline waded through the waist-deep snow. Her first priority was hydration and vitamins. She gathered handfuls of bright green pine needles, bringing them back to her shelter to steep in boiling snow water. The resulting pale tea was rich in vitamin C, staving off scurvy and providing a minor, desperately needed energy boost. But tea wouldn't sustain her. She needed protein. Madeline stripped the sturdy laces from her leather boots, replacing them with strips of torn canvas. Using the bootlaces and pliable green willow twigs, she crafted 6 simple snare traps. She set them along the base of the ravine where the snow was disturbed. Tiny, almost imperceptible trails left by snowshoe hares and ptarmigans seeking refuge in the brush. For 2 days, the snares yielded nothing. Madeline grew weaker. Her vision blurred at the edges, and the agonizing cold began to seep deeper into her bones. She spent her days huddled near her fire, rationing her energy, carefully maintaining the structural integrity of her willow dome as the heat caused the interior frost to melt and drip. On the 8th day, a sharp, echoing snap broke the silence of the hollow. Madeline scrambled out of her tunnel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waded frantically toward the nearest snare line. There, thrashing in the snow, was a large, fat snowshoe hare. It was a chaotic, gruesome struggle, but hunger erased any hesitation. She dispatched the animal with a heavy strike of her hatchet. That night, she roasted the meat over her fire, the rich, greasy fat providing a euphoric surge of energy. She saved every bone, every scrap of hide, boiling the remnants into a thick, nutrient-dense broth. For the next 2 months, this became her brutal, exhausting routine. She lived on the absolute razor's edge of existence. Some weeks the snares provided. Other weeks, she chewed on the inner cambium bark of pine trees to quiet the agonizing rumble in her belly. She lost weight rapidly, her cheekbones hollowing out, her hands becoming calloused, cracked claws. Yet beneath the emaciation, a feral, undeniable strength was taking root. She was no longer just surviving. She was adapting. She was becoming a creature of the bitterroot. But she was not the only hungry creature in the valley. In late January, during a particularly brutal cold snap that sent temperatures plummeting to 20 below zero, the owner of the massive footprint finally revealed itself. Madeline was asleep, curled tightly around the dying embers of her fire, when a sound jolted her awake. It was a heavy, rhythmic crunching of snow directly above her head. Then came the sniffing, deep, wet, and guttural, vibrating through the frozen mud of her roof. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She gripped the handle of her hatchet, her knuckles turning white. Suddenly, a terrifying weight pressed down on the willow dome. The structure groaned in protest, the woven branches creaking under the immense pressure. It was a mountain lion, an old, desperate male driven mad by the harsh winter, smelling the lingering scent of roasted hare and the warmth radiating from the chimney hole. The beast began to dig. Massive, razor-sharp claws tore through the top layer of snow, scraping violently against the frozen mud shell. Dirt and chips of ice rained down on Madeline as the cougar frantically tried to breach the roof. The willow pillars bowed inward, threatening to snap. If the structure collapsed, she would be crushed, trapped and torn to pieces. Panic threatened to consume her, but the feral instinct she had cultivated over the past 2 months took over. She couldn't wait for the roof to give. She had to fight back. Madeline grabbed a thick, burning branch from the fire. She positioned herself directly under the spot where the beast was digging. As the cougar's claws finally broke through a weak patch in the mud, exposing a gap in the willow weave and a glimpse of matted, tawny fur, Madeline thrust the burning branch upward with all her remaining strength. She jammed the fiery end directly into the beast's face through the gap. The mountain lion unleashed an ear-splitting, blood-curdling screech that echoed through the subterranean chamber. It violently ripped its paws back, the weight suddenly vanishing from the roof. Madeline heard it thrashing in the snow above, howling in agony and surprise, before the heavy sounds of its retreat faded into the howling wind. She collapsed onto the dirt floor, shaking uncontrollably, clutching the smouldering branch. She spent the rest of the night patching the hole with a mixture of wet clay and ash, reinforcing the interior with extra willow braces. The beast never returned, but the encounter changed her. She realized she was no longer the helpless victim Everett had discarded. She was a predator in her own right, forged in the frozen crucible of Miller's Hollow. She would not die here. She would live, and she would make him pay. The transition from winter to spring in the Montana mountains is not a gentle awakening. It is a violent, chaotic upheaval. By early April, the suffocating blanket of snow began to rot, turning into a heavy, slushy mess. The frozen creek at the bottom of the ravine swelled, roaring to life with churning, muddy meltwater. The constant dripping inside Madeline's shelter became a localized rainstorm, threatening to extinguish her fire and flood her pit. It was time to leave. Madeline was a ghost of her former self. Her clothes hung off her emaciated frame in tatters. Her skin was darkened with months of wood smoke and dirt, her hair wild, matted mane. But her eyes burned with a terrifying, piercing clarity. Over the grueling winter, she had sustained herself on a meager diet of trapped hares, boiled pine needles, and the bitter inner bark of the surrounding trees. She was starving, bruised, and battered, but she was alive. On a crisp, clear morning, when the sun finally broke through the perpetual grey overcast, Madeline crawled out of her willow fortress for the last time. She didn't look back. She tied her remaining scraps of dried meat into a small bundle, gripped her trusted, rusted hatchet, and began the brutal 30-mile trek toward civilization. The journey took 4 agonizing days. The spring thaw made the terrain treacherous. She waded through freezing, waist-deep mud bogs, navigated around swollen rivers, and slept in the hollows of massive cedar trees, too exhausted to build fires. Every step was fueled by a singular, burning vision. The look on Everett's face when a dead woman walked through his front door. When Madeline finally stumbled onto the paved shoulder of County Road 9, she collapsed. A passing logging truck screeched to a halt, the driver rushing out to find what looked like a feral wild woman collapsed in the gravel. Within hours, she was in a sterilized hospital room in the town of Oakhaven, hooked to an IV, surrounded by bewildered nurses and a very stern-looking local lawman named Sheriff Brody. The town was in shock. Madeline Harrison had been reported missing by her stepbrother in November. Everett had claimed she walked out in the middle of the night after an argument over the estate, distraught and unstable. Search parties had scoured the accessible trails for a week before the historic blizzard forced them back. She had been legally presumed dead just 2 weeks prior. "He left me there," Madeline told Sheriff Brody, her voice a raspy, unused whisper, yet carrying the weight of a grinding stone. "He changed the will. He locked the doors. He left me to freeze." Brody frowned, adjusting his utility belt. "That's a hell of an accusation, Ms. Harrison. Everett's been playing the grieving brother for months. He's finalizing the sale of the Harrison Lodge to a corporate developer tomorrow morning. Says he can't bear the memories." A cold, dark smile spread across Madeline's cracked lips. "Stop the sale, Sheriff, and get me a lawyer." The following morning, the atmosphere in the plush, mahogany-paneled conference room of Oakhaven's only major law firm was tense. Everett Jenkins sat at the head of the long table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, pen poised over a stack of lucrative real estate transfer documents. Opposite him sat representatives from the development firm, eager to bulldoze the historic Harrison estate to build luxury condos. "If we are all ready," Everett said, his voice slick and polished, "we can conclude this tragic chapter and move forward." The heavy double doors of the conference room swung open with a resounding crash. The room froze. Everett's pen hovered mid-air, the color draining from his face so rapidly he looked as though he might faint. Madeline stood in the doorway. She was clean, dressed in oversized clothes provided by the hospital, but she looked wild, dangerous, and undeniably alive. She was flanked by Sheriff Brody and a sharp-eyed estate attorney. "Hello, Everett," Madeline said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "Madeline?" Everett stammered, dropping his pen. He stumbled backward, his chair tipping over. You're dead. The storm. The search parties." "I dig deep," she replied coldly, stepping into the room. "Turns out you didn't dig my grave quite deep enough." The developer representatives immediately began shuffling papers, sensing a catastrophic legal disaster. "Mr. Jenkins, what is the meaning of this? You stated you were the sole heir and executor." "He lied," Madeline stated firmly. She turned to her lawyer. The lawyer produced a heavily sealed plastic evidence bag. Inside was the oversized canvas jacket Madeline had worn into the woods, her father's jacket. "During my client's recovery at the hospital, we examined the garments she was wearing. In the lining of this coat, stitched securely into a hidden breast pocket, we found a secondary document." Everett's eyes widened in sheer panic. He lunged forward, but Sheriff Brody placed a heavy hand on his chest, shoving him back. "It is a handwritten, notarized letter from the late Mr. Harrison," the lawyer continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Dated just 2 days before his passing. In it, he explicitly details his suspicion that you, Everett, were attempting to manipulate his medication and coerce a signature on a fraudulent will. He legally voids all subsequent documents and leaves the entirety of his estate, including the lodge and the surrounding thousands of acres, exclusively to his biological daughter, Madeline Harrison." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The tables had completely turned. The mountain had not erased Madeline. It had forged her into an unbreakable force, and now she was bringing the avalanche down on him. "Furthermore," Sheriff Brody stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Based on the evidence in that letter, the medical examiner's re-evaluation of your father's toxicology report, and Ms. Harrison's testimony regarding your actions in November, I am placing you under arrest, Everett. The charges are forgery, fraud, and attempted murder." Everett didn't fight. He collapsed to his knees, his tailored suit wrinkling against the expensive carpet, sobbing as the cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. He looked up at Madeline, begging silently for mercy. Madeline looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The cold of the bitterroot had frozen out any residual familial warmth she might have harbored. She simply turned her back on him, exactly as he had done to her on that freezing November afternoon. 6 months later, the Harrison Lodge stood proud against the backdrop of the turning autumn leaves. Madeline sat on the heavy oak porch, wrapped in her father's canvas jacket. She had fired the developers, fired the staff, and reclaimed her land. The lodge was hers, but she rarely slept in the massive master bedroom. Instead, whenever the wind howled through the pines and the frost began to bite at the windows, Madeline would walk the 6 miles out to Miller's Hollow. There, hidden beneath the sprawling roots and marshy soil, her willow fortress remained. It was a monument to her resilience, a quiet, earthen sanctuary where she had fought the mountain and won. She survived the darkness, and in doing so, she became the undisputed master of her own wild domain. If Madeline's incredible journey of survival, resilience, and ultimate justice inspired you, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Stories like hers remind us of the unbreakable human spirit when pushed to the absolute limit. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another gripping true survival tale. Drop a comment below letting us know what you would have done in her frozen shoes. Stay safe out there.